Good day, everyone. For our report, the main question asked is what are the characteristics of late capitalism that impact the Lumads? To answer this, Sir Juji and I are assigned with chapters 10 and 11, and I have chosen chapter 10, which looks into the Lumad experience using the theoretical lens of accumulation by dispossession of David Harvey. To read the opening paragraph of Chapter 10, let me quote Carl Gaspar's observation, which states that the fate of the Lumad as a marginalized and dispossessed people can be traced historically to colonial and neo-colonial political economic features. As such, their powerlessness is bound to continue unless these deep-seated social configurations are actually challenged. Now, according to David Harvey, in addition to the primitive accumulation of Karl Marx's theory, what accumulation by dispossession does is to release a set of assets, which includes labor power, at very low and in some instances zero cost. Now, overaccumulated capital can then seize hold of such assets and immediately turn these into profitable use. Now, capitalism has violently transformed social relations from one that is defined by patronage arrangements related to land to one that is predominantly characterized by an emancipated labor power dependent on wage labor. Now, the Lumad experience can be traced during the encomienda system. The encomienda system, where there was the commercialization of agriculture, gave rise to landed elites. Now, this was further reinforced by the homesteading and resettlement programs of the Americans when they dispossessed the lands of the Lumads in the 1900s. Homesteading actually refers to the opening up of public lands for agricultural purposes to qualified citizens who are chosen to develop and make the lands productive. Resettlement, on the other hand, would mean the transfer of abode from one to the other with the purpose of making this settlement to the new abode permanent. Now, this was how migrants from Luzon and Visayas settled in Mindanao and owned properties. Both programs did not only push the Lumads from their lands, but these relocated them to positions of poor farmers, poor workers, who are dependent on the government policies for their share of the state wealth. Now, accumulation by dispossession is actually observed in these instances. 1. The commodification of privatization of land and the forceful expulsion of peasant populations. A good example would be the EDCOR under President Magsaysay for the hooks in the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. Second is the conversion of various forms of property rights into exclusively private property rights. Third is the suppression of rights to the commons. Fourth is the commodification of labor power and the suppression of alternative or indigenous forms of production and consumption. A good example would be these IPs were thought to make laces. Fifth is colonial, neo-colonial, and imperial processes of appropriation of assets, including natural resources. And a good example would be Panamin, the role of Manuel Elizalde Jr., a Filipino millionaire who became a presidential advisor to the protection of cultural minorities under the Marcos regime. 6 is the monetization of exchange and taxation, particularly in land. The example that I'm giving here is the role of World Trade Organization on the rice tariffication law. 7th is the slave trade, which continues that focuses on the sex industry. And 8th is usury, the national debt, and the use of the credit system, wherein the IMF or the International Monetary Fund has a very big role in. In the contemporary world, David Harvey said, the primary vehicle for accumulation by dispossession has been the forcing open of markets throughout the world by institutional pressures exercised to the IMF and World Trade Organization, usually backed by the power of the United States, and to a lesser extent Europe, by denying them access to their own vast market to the countries that refuse to dismantle their protections. Good example would be the role of World Trade Organization and trade liberalization. Again, in the Philippine context would be the rice tariffication law, and of course, tariff in the American context. To end my presentation, I would like to again quote from Carl Gaspar. He said, "It thus seemed inevitable that despite the promise of people power, the indigenous people still remain powerless. The grip of neocolonialism on our country's mode of production, our political economy, even the reins of the government, the business conglomerates, the landlord clique, and on the majority of the Filipino people has become tighter, if anything." Thank you for listening to my presentation. The next report will focus on how capitalism operates in the ground and how these elements impact current war of extinction waged against the Lumads. Thank you and good morning.
Good morning. As a continuation on the continued inequality of the Philippine indigenous community, my report focuses on the experiences in the island of Mindanao, since it became the new political and economic avenue of the Philippine political elite, who have dominated ever since, like the Marcos cronies, the transnational corporations, and the local warlords. How the Philippines became a host of apparatus that helped bolstering the strength of these elite actors. And after gaining the independence as a Republic of the Philippines, is now an elite-led democracy who keep themselves in power and in control, and who continuously act as a successor in the process of marginalization to the Mindanao indigenous communities who were displaced and violently dispossesses their ancestral land because of the forces laid down by the Philippine state, particularly on the resettlement program, exploiting the role of law, use of the law enforcement, the police, and the military. And in fact, the worst scenario was murdering of some individuals who refuses to embrace and follow its mandates. Just like what happened to Neco de la Mente, one of the Mamano indigenous people in Surigao del Norte. He was about to testify his people's suffering to the NCIP, or the so-called National Commission on Indigenous People, and opposed the mining expansion in the area. Another one is Jamie Ligoyon of Dao, Quezon Bukidnon, one of the Matigsalog tribal leader, an anti-mining advocate in the province, and he was murdered by a paramilitary personnel. So those are the manifestation that the state is sponsoring or behind the suffering of the Lumads in Mindanao, and eventually inculcating the culture of violence and impunity that restrain the local residents or the indigenous people from participating to any meaningful decision-making process every now and then. So such incidents would try to challenge the laminated legitimacy of various enacted framework that serves as illegal instruments promulgated by the states, just like the provision of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. Article 12, Section 5 and Section 2 states that all land of public domain, waters, and other natural resources are owned by the state. It shall not be alienated, meaning it shall not be awarded to any economic and political elite in the state. One of the great examples of this manifestation, which is feasible in the history of logging, agricultural plantations, and minings that have plundered Mindanao through various mechanisms. In terms of crony, we have Roberto Salas Benedicto, a Marcos crony who appropriated the land from the Manubos in Quezon, Bukidnon province. The pineapple plantation of Del Monte Philippines Incorporated in Camp Phillips, Bukidnon displaces huge number of Higaonon tribal community. The hydroelectric power plants along the Agus River from Lake Lanao benefited the lowland population at the expense of the displacement of significant Maranao population. In terms of mining, in Surigao del Norte, it displaces the Mamanwa indigenous people who were forcibly evicted by the military at gunpoint to their ancestral land. These are but just in an example, few examples of how the Philippine state was utilized in order to dispossess and accumulate for the sake of a private profit. Another framework was the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. Now, this law recognizes and promotes the rights of indigenous cultural community following the promulgations of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who demand on the principle of securing free, prior, and informed consent process. The law grants the right of indigenous community to ancestral domain claims, with the NCIP as the so-called overseer. But unfortunately, this framework of redress have actually become an instrument for the continued marginalization, and in many cases promoting the extrajudicial killing and forced evacuations of indigenous leaders and their communities, as I mentioned a while ago. Issuance of mining and other business-related certifications have been compromised and if not corrupted. In addition, the IPs were associated with the concept of red tagging. Finally, the BBL, or Bangsamoro Basic Law, was finally ratified. It creates complexity and disruption to the Bangsamoro people, diminishing the distinct identity of the non-Moro and Moro indigenous peoples that would trigger perhaps conflicts among them geographically. So all these unfortunate circumstances are just the consequences of the cultural practices inherited by the Philippine elite from their US and Spanish masters. That is all. Thank you.